is István Tarrósy, who is a Fulbright scholar here at UF in the African Studies Department. But he's also Hungarian, and he has been willing to give us a talk on what's going on right now in Hungary, and the election is coming up in Hungary, so it's particularly of interest. He's an assistant professor of political science and director of the Africa Research Center at the University of Pécs, which is a university town not unlike the University of Florida, but in the south of Hungary. He teaches various courses, both in political culture and African global politics, and has been involved in a project which I can't actually figure out how to pronounce it, but
Immigrapoli. Like,
okay, but it's migration
like
game.
Monopoly.
Like Monopoly, okay. About immigrants, so a migration game. And his publications include Hungary's Global Opening to an Interpolar World, Global Opening for Hungary, A New Beginning for Hungarian Africa Policy, Two Giants on the Same Soil, A Closer Look at Afro-Asian Relations via Comparing Chinese and Japanese Development in Tanzania. And so he is a political scientist who studies both Africa in a comparative political perspective, and today he's going to talk to us about Hungarian politics with a perspective.
Yes. Thank you very much, Alice. Today I wish to address an interesting topic, I guess, because as Alice mentioned, elections are coming up in April, actually on the 6th of April, general elections. And in light of the upcoming elections, I wish to address a number of issues connected to Hungarian political traditions and the heritage we have actually that haunts us. Let's put it like that first. A heritage not only from the immediate past, meaning just before the change of the system at the end of the 80s, let's say those 40 decades or something, meaning the communist socialist era, but in the course of our history basically. And I wish to address political culture in that respect and how political culture has been in transition in the country. And that's the structure of my talk. First, maybe not all of you are familiar with the basic things connected to political culture as a notion, so I wish to address that first. I wish to visit or revisit Dahrendorf's clock theory, which I think will be a kind of a help for us today to understand transition, and that will be the same with Rustow as well, and his dynamic theory of democracy, which will come up later on. A couple of very fresh and really interesting and I would say later on groundbreaking events I also want to come up with as examples, and I have just given a name, you know, fifth bullet point over there, Paksgate, following upon Watergate. In respect, a seemingly great scandal actually that has been coming up very recently, connected to a nuclear deal with Russia, and you'll see what I mean by that. And of course, you know, some major characteristics in detail so that you really understand the nature of Hungarian political culture. Very briefly, the foundation stones, as we know, of course, and it's not only about the United States where it really was born. As you can see, the first book ever published on political culture in that comparative perspective by Gabriel Almond and Sidney Verba from the University of Chicago in the 1930s, early 1960s, 63 actually. But it's really something that has been all around us, as you can see, very much connected to culture as such and very much part of the general culture of people. And because of that, basically, and of course I will not go through all the bullet points or points whatsoever, just to fresh up a couple of things. When you address political culture, then you really talk about culture, and because you do that, you need to be cautious, because in present-day Hungary you can hear all around that Hungarian political culture is very underdeveloped. That's one kind of approach, really underdeveloped. Not as developed as, for instance, the American political culture, a kind of a comparison. But can you really say this? Can you really say that Hungarian culture is underdeveloped or not as developed as, for instance, American culture, or Kenyan culture is more developed than, for instance, the culture in Somalia, and so on and so forth? Can you say that? This kind of hierarchical approach is, I think, a dead-end street. So the thing is that when you address political culture, when you address the political culture of a given country, then you need to look at it in its unique evolvement, development, dynamism. So within Hungary, and of course, then you can make comparative research, and you can compare institutionally, structurally, a number of things. But when you talk about culture as such, therefore political culture, which means, as you can see, a kind of a chain between the individual and the institutions, a kind of a group of orientations that reflect somehow attitudes of the citizens, citizenry as such. And of course you have the ideal typical kind of typology of Almond and Verba, parochial, subject and participant type of political cultures, and civic culture as a kind of a mixture of all these. Then you see that it's about beliefs, it's about attitudes, it's about feelings, it's about a number of things, a pattern of understandings, attitudes, which dispose people towards behaving in a particular way politically. It's about how people think, know, and behave, and value, and evaluate, basically, the political system they live in. And all societies in that respect, as Castle and Robbins said, all societies possess a political culture, which is important in the country's very specific historical context. When in the 70s and then later on in the 1980s, Hungarian political scientists started to investigate Hungarian political culture based upon all these typologies. And of course, after the 1960s, when Almond and Verba came up with this model, they got a number of criticisms. So they revisited in the 1980s their basic original idea. And still pointed out a number of important things, but could accept a number of criticisms. For instance, about the importance of subcultures, the importance of regional differences, the importance of age differences. Therefore, generations matter in terms of understandings and beliefs and attitudes and so on and so forth. So in that respect, those political scientists in Hungary who started investigating Hungarian political culture emphasized the very country-specific historical context, the very country-specific historical development. That is basically the framework of our understanding. And I think that's important to point out. Political culture is country-specific, unique, and it's the subjective side of politics. It's about the people, it's about how the people think, behave, and evaluate politics, as I told you. Let's look at Hungarian political traditions first. There are a number of influences you can come up with. And as I mentioned, the foundation of the Hungarian state, I think that's the first important moment. The state ideology of the first king, Saint Stephen, and his constitutional way of thinking. The second point is also important because when you read about democratic transition, transition from the party system to a more open, liberal democracy-oriented, multi-party competitive system, then you read a number of papers, a number of books, even with the title Back to Europe. Let me just come up with a very particular title of a book from Karen Henderson from the University of Leicester, Back to Europe. Because what Hungary and Hungarian citizenry, Hungarian politicians have always been talking about is that Hungary, in terms of its values, connections, culture, cultural heritage, always felt to be belonging to the more Western part of the continent. Western type of value system and so on. as opposed to its geographical location, as opposed to a particular historical period concerning the bipolar world when Hungary was part of the Soviet bloc, therefore was part of the East. So Hungary in that respect, and people there, the Hungarians, have always felt a kind of a very peculiar situation to have been stuck between East and West, which really is a psychological aspect of any aspiration in political terms, in economic terms, in building international relations, foreign policies, and so on and so forth. A kind of a feeling that we have always belonged to the West, but unfortunately we're part of the East, especially talking about the Soviet bloc and the bipolar world. And of course a number of other things about cleavages and all kinds of fault lines in society, drawing upon Stein-Rocken's classical theory and even more. So these things definitely determined, let's just pick one, the clerical religious cleavage, the Habsburgs and the Catholic aristocracy on the one hand, and the Protestant noblemen, Calvinist Protestant noblemen on the other hand. This kind of cleavage also determined different political traditions in the country. If we take a look at the last, let's say, 150 years, 180 years or so, then of course you can come up with even more eras or sub-periods that were really influential in terms of developing a political culture, that type of political culture. Just mentioning, the revolution of 1848-49, which contributed to strengthening parliamentary traditions, but still not contributing that much to strengthening more democratic traditions. Definitely the Horthy era, Miklos Horthy's reign between 1920 and 44. Maybe we will come back to that at a certain moment in that sense. And definitely the communist regime, which was definitely not unified. So you can see different periods with different characteristics, ranging from classical totalitarian dictatorship characteristics up until the very loosened up and relaxed political dictatorship, and a number of economic reforms of the very last days of the Kádár era. And then, of course, when you look at what determined political culture in the country, you must deal with the actual change of the system, which I will revisit in a minute on another slide, but let me just add to that. The change of the system itself determined how people obviously behave in a number of ways politically. Horthy is back. Miklos Horthy, well, in September 2012, 3 members of parliament of the far-right party, which is called Jobbik in Hungarian, which means better, because that's better for you to vote for them, better for you to have them in power, most probably. So Jobbik came up with the idea to have 2013 as the memorial year to Miklos Horthy, who used to be an admiral, an aristocratic admiral, the regent of Hungary in this period. The regent of Hungary was a regency, the Kingdom of Hungary then, as it was called. So a memorial year. Fortunately, and let me really emphasize this, fortunately this did not happen, because Horthy is a very controversial, and his era is a very controversial period, and there is no unified view in the country, in the population whatsoever over his reign in that respect. But coming from the right, and as you could see from the far right, there are attempts to have him as an important figure of our new democratic political culture in that respect. You can see, and maybe, I mean, those of you who are into Central European studies, Central and Eastern European studies and Hungarian studies, you may recall the picture on the left, but I'm certain you may not saw any such photos on the right. I was really surprised, because I don't know whether you can check it or not, there is a huge dragon tattoo on his left arm. So I was really surprised, you know. And there were just a couple of such figures actually with huge tattoos. And as long as he took his family to have some nice swimming actually in present-day Croatian Pula. That's the town, very down in the south on the Adriatic coast. That was one of his favorite places. Of course, some could take such a photo of him. But anyway, so there are a couple of such instances which certainly contribute to the political socialization of the Hungarian citizenry. Let me stop here for 1 minute. Political socialization I have mentioned. Obviously, when you talk about political culture, when you talk about values, when you talk about beliefs, understandings, feelings, whatsoever, that really compose political culture, you need to talk about a kind of a social learning process. And that social learning process is political socialization. How you acquire this knowledge, how you acquire and meet, you know, all kinds of influences that will help you develop yourself as a political adult. So that's the process how you become a political adult. Now, all these instances contribute to a kind of a new political socialization period of the Hungarian citizenry. Ralph Dahrendorf, I think, was really fascinating from a number of angles. He came up with a great book in 1990, which was written in a very unique way, because if you take a look at the subtitle of the book, it's kind of a supposed potential letter that could have been sent to a gentleman in Warsaw. That's the subtitle, more or less. He addresses the revolution in Europe, as it is seen in the title. He addresses transition. He addresses democratic transition. And he comes up with, or came up with, the 3 clocks kind of theory, which is about how much time you need from certain aspects to transit from a dictatorial regime into a more democratic and open system. You first have the hour of the lawyer, which means that in the constitutional sense, in the basic laws, in the sense of the basic laws, you need at least, or well, maximum, yeah, about half a year, so 6 months you need to put down all these new foundations in terms of lawmaking. Then the hour of the politician comes, which is about the reforms in the economic sense, and of course additional laws connected to the constitutional reform, 6 years. And then you have the hour of the citizen, which is about civil society, which is about rebuilding the cultural codes, the whole social setting in that respect. As Dahrendorf put it, civil society will be the key in terms of this transition. Let's look at what happened in Hungary, whether Hungary could meet Dahrendorf's criteria. Yes, indeed. If you take a look at the political change, it took approximately 6 months in terms of the constitutional laws, freedom of association, the basic laws, the basic new laws actually, electoral law, which was changed very recently, and you will see in what direction, favoring the majority. You'll see what I mean by that. Then the freedom, all kinds of freedoms put down into the legal setting. Freedom of religion, freedom of press, party law, self-governance, and so on and so forth. More or less half a year. In the economic transition sense, about 6 years were needed, and you may recall the so-called Bokros package. That is in 1995, more or less. So yeah, 6 years later, an important kind of shock therapy kind of approach to have a faster pace towards market economy, privatization, and so on and so forth. But you can raise the question, many people do that actually, shall we wait another 60 years until the change in civic attitudes will enable democracy to work properly? Because what you can see is that, yes, 30 years have passed, at least 30 years we will need, but even more. Because what he says, and let me quote with that, let me find where it is anyway. Somewhere, backwards, no problem. He says that 60 years is barely enough. That's the point, barely enough to have in the social, civic kind of sense to have a functioning, a more mature kind of democratic setting. When you think back in the kind of listing of the influences that determined and determine political culture in Hungary, I mentioned the sub-periods of the communist socialist past, let's call it the immediate past, before the change of the system. And I think you need to be aware of the heritage of this immediate past. First of all, the very heavy state control, which really meant that everything was put under the very strict control of the Communist Party. And of course, as you could see, in terms of differentiating between the sub-eras of this period, it was gradually loosening up. But still, the control of the party in political sense definitely stayed until the change of the system, which meant that, for instance, society became atomized, which meant that family remained the only community for the citizenry to kind of remain independent, stay independent to some extent. That was only the family. So everybody retired into their nutshells basically, and that meant that really society fell into its atoms in that sense. But gradually, as this kind of state control was loosening up over the economy, a kind of a second economic sphere gradually developed, kind of a double society came into existence, and this will be important in terms of understanding attitudes, behaviors of the citizenry toward the state, because it will be a very, and you will see, a very ambivalent nature of the citizen-state relationship. So this kind of double society, this kind of double value system will matter a lot. Political cynicism and the ever so green Hungarian pessimism. This has been mentioned all the time, and it's not a kind of an urban legend, but it's really empirically measured and empirically proven that Hungary is among the top most pessimistic countries in the world. And of course, you need to look at the very important questions, detailed questions of the given surveys, but any survey I will come up with will prove this. So it's not just an urban legend, which can be, kind of a joke, but no, it's definitely not a joke. Some major characteristics of Hungarian political culture and some important aspects of Hungarian politics and present-day Hungary. This kind of ambivalent attitude towards the state, which means that at the same time, people have high expectations and they are highly cynical. And there is a low-level trust coming from the citizenry. Really high expectations for services, for instance, from the state, and very cynical on the other hand. Low-level political integration, partially due to the heritage of this atomized society of the communist socialist period. But just an example. Do I buy a bus ticket, for instance, when I use public transport? That's a question in Hungary. Many people don't. Many people don't. At the same time, however, they criticize the buses. Why? Those buses are so dirty. Or the metro. So they don't contribute, but expect. It's really a factual thing. There are a number of surveys on how much people don't contribute in that respect. Concerning double values, the double value system, what that means. First of all, keeping to or adhering to, obeying the rules, obviously, of the system. At the same time, avoiding, tricking, violating the rules of the system. So it's really a combination of the two, a double value system. Typical example, tax-paying morality. You can guess. People don't like paying taxes. Of course, maybe that's not a Hungarian kind of phenomenon, but in Hungary, it's a phenomenon, for sure. If you look at, and it's not a joke, if you look at, for instance, the Scandinavian countries, that's not an issue. If you look at other countries, and you can compare that, it's not an issue. Another example, using the infrastructure of your workplace for private purposes. That's a typical example. So for instance, when I go to department, secretary's office, there is a big Xerox machine there. And, sometimes I could see some of my colleagues, whoever, whatever, photocopying, children's tales for their children. Using public infrastructure for private purposes. That's a very normal, everyday thing still in the country. So that's the kind of a double value approach from the citizenry toward the system and toward the state. I have mentioned pessimism already, and let me just come up with some data then. I have mentioned that Hungary is among the world's most pessimistic countries, top 12 actually, according to a 2011 Gallup survey of 147 countries. You can check it out. And so the survey pointed out that actually these are the countries, and the majority of these pessimistic countries are relatively safe and wealthy. So it's not about measuring whether people think their lives will be unsatisfactory in war-ravaged parts of the world and so on and so forth. So wealthy states, more or less, relatively safe states, but still very pessimistic. Citizens believe that their lives are going to get worse in the near future. And when I ask anyone, basically, in my own family, or in my friends' families, about the future, about the next year, the immediate answer will be, oh, don't ask me, it's going to be worse, for sure. That's the immediate answer. And that really resembles people's, attitudes and expectations about the future. So it's not only about the country, but it's about their own households at the same time. Pessimistic about their households. Another survey could be Eurobarometer, you can check it out. Since, let's say, spring 2009, I have been looking at that. Unsatisfied with the quality of life. EU membership is a bad thing, at least for 25% of the population, which is a huge percent if you compare it with, regional countries, especially from the former Soviet bloc. And only 40% thought that life could be better in the EU in 2030. Hungary was among the most pessimistic EU member states, together with Greece and Bulgaria, actually in the last couple of years, in that sense. Trust is very much connected to pessimism, trust in institutions. When you ask people about what kind of institutions they trust the most, of course, those are the actors that are the farthest away from everyday politics. So let's say the Constitutional Court in that sense, or even more if you stay within the Hungarian realm, the President of the Republic, not parties for sure. And even more, if you have a more comparative global picture, then of course, let's say the United Nations or some European institutions, which are even more farther away from everyday happenings, everyday political happenings. And the lowest trust, around 10%, is about political parties. A 2012 survey about a question, for instance, whether Hungarians were satisfied with democracy, made by one of the Hungarian think tanks, showed that 25% said yes, and 75% said no. And in the UK, it's about 50%, so it's just a kind of a comparison. But in a regional comparative setting, Hungary showed the lowest rate with the 25%. Of course, it's really difficult to distinguish when you ask such a question, because the functioning of the system differentiated from those in power the government and this question, whether democracy is good or not, whether they are satisfied with democracy, it's not an easy thing. So the citizen will not be able to distinguish, that's my point, that much. And those who said yes, those came from, and it's 2012, those came from the supporters of the party in government. So that's another aspect when we talk about trust in institutions. There is another point over there, I think that's a very important point, if you want to understand Hungarian political culture. It's about subjective political competence, as it is called, which means that it's about the belief of the citizens, about their ability to influence the political processes, decision making, and the belief that they can safeguard their own interests. This is very, very low in Hungary. Hungary can be characterized with a very low subjective political competence. People are very skeptical about their roles, whether their voice can be heard at all, and what they say can mean anything for the whole process. They can really change anything. But at the same time, if you really focus on the ambivalence of the whole system and the whole transition, at the same time, they have very high expectations still about what kind of quality services the state should provide. And I'm sure the kind of socialist reflexes come back and live on in that respect. As opposed to, for instance, again, the Scandinavian states, where they have really high beliefs in their ability to influence, as well as they have high expectations at the same time to get those services from the state. And of course that differs if you come to the US as well. That's a different story here. Weaknesses of the representation of civil interests and civil society as such is immediately connected to this. Is protest culture a missing element? When you talk about political culture, you need to talk about protests and how, under any circumstance, basically, the citizenry can make its voice heard. Protests are definitely inevitable elements of any civic culture. Active participation is key to any democratic kind of political culture. And of course, when you visit this issue, there are a number of good pieces you can read in English as well. For instance, from Máté Szabó. Here in your library, you can find a good book actually about political culture in Central Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, and there is a chapter he wrote about protest culture. So I really highly recommend that to you. That's from 1996, and he really takes a kind of a historic journey, and he says, and points out with a number of examples that mobilization of social movements and the voices of discontent is not a new phenomenon in Hungary. Of course, there are a number of elements, a number of instances. The interesting thing is that with the change of the system, there was a substantial transformation in this respect too. And there were a number of instances for mobilization, the so-called taxi driver blockade from October 1990. But what is truly important is that concerning the actual change of the system, people, in the psychological sense, people did not really feel that they were changing the system, because as you can think back and your readings and whatever you learned or you may, then another book can be recalled, and that's from Professor Tökés, Rudolf Tökés, The Negotiated Revolution. Hungary's change was a negotiated revolution in that sense, meaning that it was a series of roundtable talks with those in power and the opposition forces, but the people were not that much involved. They didn't go in the streets, they didn't protest, they didn't really take an active part, and therefore did not feel that they took an active part in changing the system. And they wanted a new system, and they did not contribute to that in that respect. So I think that is also connected to the Hungarian soul still today. And of course, Szabó comes up with a number of other examples. The Democratic Charta, for instance, an important umbrella organization of several groups of citizens, organizing public protests against anti-democratic tendencies, racism, and so on and so forth. a number of alternative movements which really contributed to changing the Carter regime in that sense. But I think protest culture and the culture of protest is absolutely important when we talk about political culture. That photo is from the 9th of February. Just turn our attention to the very present day situation. Actually, that's the building of the president's office. And actually the president lives there. You know, it's completely different from the United States, obviously, because in such an instance, those would not leave. You know, they would have been shot for sure. What they could do, they could jump and they could sit on the balcony from outside, you know, of the president's house. They could put their, you know, banners as well as.
Are you saying they were able to jump up from the outside, climb up there, and hang their banners?
Exactly, exactly. Because it's in the Buda Castle area, it's a completely different story because the president's office is part of the housing all around.
So it's more like number 10 Downing Street, where it's just like a sort of an attractive, sizable house, row house among the
Yes, but from the outside, from this part basically, there is no fence, there is no, you know, fenced territory. Of course, guards are somewhere, don't know where, but somewhere, you know, but they could do that. No, I'm really happy that they did, so no problem, because they were protesting against a very crucial thing, and that is, I will call the Gate. It's about this nuclear deal with Russia, and they wanted to protest that and demand that a referendum is announced, so that the people should decide upon this deal, not the government. But the deal is signed, and the government is okay with that, and the parliament, of course, approved. So these people are not just spontaneously organized individuals. Obviously, because if you take a look at protest culture, not just in Hungary but in East Central Europe, then most of these protests are agent-driven or party organized. Party affiliated, unit organized in that respect. So they are also connected to the opposition forces in that sense. But I think it's an important moment. And let's just turn our attention now to the upcoming elections. And of course I will be addressing POX in a minute in more detail. Because I have mentioned that the parliament approved this government deal with Russia. I think that's important, because all such, you know, government-to-government contracts should be, and it's in the constitution, must be approved by the parliament. Well, up until 2014, Hungary used to have, still of course has, because the upcoming elections will change the system, we have 386 members of parliament. At present there are 5 political parties, and 27 of these MPs are independent MPs, which is really strange. Why? Because when you look at what happened in 2010, that elections, it was only one independent person who got a seat in the parliament. All the others were connected to political parties. In the meantime, however, they had the opportunity to say, I don't want to stay in the party realms, and I want to step out of the party realms and sit in the so-called independent seats. You know, 27 people, 26 people in that respect, that's a huge number. And not just you know, from the left, not just from the right, from all around basically, from the political spectrum as such. So these are the parties. Fidesz is the party, one of the parties, and from these parties, the party who really changed the system at the end of the 1980s. So they are the Young Democrats. They actually are those, and Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister, is there. And of course I have a question as well, where are the women? Just one, the blonde woman over there, who is deputy state secretary for God knows what, because she is such a joker. She can be any deputy state secretary for anything in the course of political history in the country. Anyway, so Viktor Orban is there, and he was really kind of a hero type of guy with the change of the system, and he was part of the social movements that were building up at a certain moment of time, and then formulated the political party of the Young Democrats. The Christian Democrats are in coalition with them. The other guy in the glasses, just very close to him, is the leader of that party. The socialists are in the parliament, stayed in the parliament. Jobbik, better, is there, the far-right party, and a very new political formation called Politics Can Be Different, a liberal formation of young intelligentsia, mainly from Budapest, but from urban frameworks and landscape, could also kind of come together and formulate a party, and then over the threshold of 5% they could get into parliament. Now the question is whether they can stay in parliament. That will be an issue, at least for me and for many of us. Where are the women? Yes, women representation is always an issue all around the world, and it's really interesting to mention that the most female MPs can be found in Rwanda, in Rwanda's parliament in Africa, and of course the Scandinavian countries, but not in Hungary for sure, as you can see. So 9% only in this present parliament. Well, from 2014, the number of seats will be reduced to 199. That's a very important step forward, I would say. It's a very important and good step to reduce the expenditure of the state from a number of angles, and so on and so forth. But how it was done is an interesting thing. And of course, the ideal size of any parliament is an interesting thing. But let's not deal with the cubic root rule, how to determine that. Just some examples. Sweden has 349 members of parliament. Slovakia with 5.4 million has 150 MPs. Finland with 5.4 million has 200, and so on and so forth. The Czech Republic has a bicameral parliament, about 10 million people, 200 plus 81. So that varies. But I think this move is important. This is the very freshest scandal or potential scandal about this nuclear deal. Paksh is located about 60 miles down southwards from the capital, Budapest, and it produces, as the sole nuclear power plant of the country, produces 40% of the total electric supply. And the deal is about building 2 new reactors. I'm just coming to the. Do I have?
We have 5 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's perfectly fine. So 2 new reactors will be built by Russia. It's as you can see, a huge deal, $13.5 billion US. And let me just, as a comparison, give you the annual total budget of the country, which is $70 billion US. So it's a huge thing, and it will be done using a huge Russian loan. Now this issue is a kind of a secret deal, as it is seen, and it was voted for. It was approved by the 2/3 majority of the governing coalition parties in parliament, and no one else. About this deal, you could see in the internet a number of interviews within the parliament building asking all these people why they voted for this. They were very arrogant, and some of them, even an MP, a female MP, Maria Wittner, said it's none of the people's business. That was her answer to this question. It's none of the people's business. Well, it's definitely it is, because it's not only in my lifetime, but in my grandchildren's lifetime as well. An issue, because it's such a huge commitment on behalf of the state. Well, I think that's really an issue, because it's about Hungarian political culture. It's about how Hungary and the governing, forces think about Hungarian democracy. Well, you could see some protesters But what about the citizenry at large? Very lethargic, very apolitical, very apathetic, and so on and so forth. And they of course don't like this, they don't want this, but they don't believe that if they say anything, then that would change anything to the better. Connected again to the very low subjective side of their political participation. Is this a country of consequences then? You know, it's really interesting to visit this issue because Tamás Fritz, a Hungarian political scientist who is really considered a right-oriented political scientist, but I think a very clever man from a number of angles, came up with this notion, a country, Hungary, a country without consequences, but he related to this issue to the events of the 2000s, especially to the previous government, especially to the activities of the previous government, and that nothing really happened after, you know, those government steps, decisions. You can find a number of examples. I think that this term is even more profound today than in the early 2000s. Professor George Schöpflin said Hungary is an incomplete democracy. George Henry from, you can find his piece from the Brussels Journal, wrote that it's a goulash democracy, somehow reflecting upon the goulash communism, kind of the happiest barrack kind of idea about Hungary. Absurdistan, another kind of not that jocular, but still shocking kind of phrase. And very recently, connected to this evolving scandal about this nuclear deal, one of the journalists wrote that we are now in the gate of Putin's Eurasian Union. In summary, we can say that it's an immature democracy with all the practices. How large is the next parliament going to be? As I told you, 199 members. Still a very complicated system remaining, and that means really, if you are interested in that, we can talk about it later on. But the previous system meant that it was a combination of individual constituencies, meaning you know, the voter cast a ballot directly for an individual candidate. There were party lists, compensation lists, and so on and so forth. This kind of complication stayed in the system. It's not a two-run game now, it's a one-run game with newly designed constituencies and out-of-country votes. Now this means a number of things, and I would like to finish off with this very short 1 minute kind of video from a friend of mine who actually is the director of the American Corner in Veszprém. I don't know whether you know that there are American corners all around the world, fostering American culture and so on and so forth. Sorry, I can't have the loudspeakers, but I do think that we can hear what his opinion is about this new system. I consider Hungary as an immature democracy. You can check, for instance, the very latest Press Freedom Index, really horrific figures from the last 2 years. What we can say is that, you know, as it was put in the title of this presentation today, that democracy in Hungary is in crisis. Yes, there are a number of challenges, as you could see, a number of obstacles. But as Rostow said, there may be many roads to democracy, but if procedures are not kept, the road will be way too long. Thank you very much for your attention.